Great. So we're happy to go wherever you guys want to go, state level, federal level. Where are we headed in disability policy? And what did we say that you don't agree with or that you want to clarify or ask questions about? Harold, do you want to get it started?
Pardon?
Do you want to get it started?
Oh, no, I'm just thinking, I guess, one of the key unfinished things, if you look at, what has not been updated or reauthorized or reshaped, the ADA was restored partly by the amendments. WIOA finally reshaped the VR legislation. Every child ESSA reauthorized and reshaped No Child Left Behind with some positive things, including the fact that that no longer the children with most significant disabilities, children in alternate assessments, have to be considered as school dropouts under federal accountability. So there's some, I guess one thing I would like that impacts both yours and Jeff's work is something that has not been reauthorized since 2004, and that's the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And do you see any major things happening in that, as well as major things that we should be advocating in the reauthorization of that? Because even though it took forever to get VR reauthorized, it took forever to get No Child Left Behind or the Elementary and Secondary Education Act reauthorized, they got done. IDEA will get done. So do you see that on the horizon from both a state or federal perspective, and what needs to be in the new authorization of IDEA?
You want me to go first on it?
So,
if my memory serves, the last time that IDEA was reauthorized was 2004, and before that, I want to say 97.
That's right.
Okay, so I think Connie Garner was the staff person that negotiated both of those reauthorizations as a mom of a young woman with intellectual disability and a very, very talented negotiator, legislative staff person working for a very, very talented senator in Senator Kennedy and a very powerful senator. And Connie's perspective is every time we reauthorize IDEA, it gets worse. She sees the powers that be around that legislation. She knows how powerful the teachers' unions are in their ability to influence Democrats, and the teachers' unions generally only want to make IDEA worse from a disability civil rights perspective. She knows how powerful the school administrators are and all these different constituencies that have, and from her perspective, a somewhat nefarious agenda around an IDEA reauthorization. So she's worried that if we, bite the bullet and sit down and try to renegotiate IDEA, we'll end up with more flexibility for schools, less protections for individual students with disabilities. And so she's argued, for years that we don't want to reauthorize it. That's not actually my perspective. There's a wild card, Harold, that we don't really know, which is if we continue to have a Republican Senate and a Republican House and a Republican White House, let's just assume we go there. At some point, I think the Republicans will say any law that has not been reauthorized is subject to not having appropriations. Like they'll start messing with appropriations of things that haven't been authorized. And that's a real risk for the DD Act. If all of our programs now are not reauthorized, because it's been the last time the DD Act, which is the law that authorizes protection advocacy and the University Centers for Excellence and the DD Councils was 2000. I think that'll be a motivator for us to come to the table and try to get a reauthorization. Yeah. So I think Republicans will have ways to get us to the table on a lot of these bills if they want to do a reauthorization. So I feel like we need to find a way to get the stuff reauthorized that works for Republicans and that minimizes the potential for negative policy. And I think with IDEA, the best way to do that would be to do a surgical tweak to IDA, not a full-scale reauthorization, to try to bring IDA in alignment philosophically with ESSA and with WIOA. So if we can come up with some narrow tweaks to IDEA that would support the goals of WIOA, which were very bipartisan, and the goals of ESSA, which were very bipartisan, that feels doable to me without doing a full-scale reauthorization. Now, the only way that you can do that is if you have bipartisan agreement that you're not going to open this up for all these other amendments. There's going to be need to be a package that's negotiated, and in the Senate, there's going to need to be unanimous consent that we're not going to wreak havoc on the floor and try to do things that are ultimately going to make it toxic.
Well,
and I do think that's possible.
The clearest area where there's, where it has to be aligned is WIOA. There's a transition age. DR is now able to go down as age 14, and yet IDEA mandates planning and transition from 16. One of the Connie Garner was absolutely right. Transition language was weakened between 97 and 2004 because 97 language actually had 14, raised to 16. Kentucky, because Kentucky, Jeff, does do something right, kept the transition planning, you have to say that, kept the transition planning at 14. So one of the surgical things would be to ensure that at least the planning part of it began at age 14. There's probably some other places. Yeah. Because we have the bipartisan support for real law. So I think, if that kind of approach, looking at alignment with other federal legislation, might be a really good strategy.
So for people that might not have been able to hear Harold, he said that Kentucky has the transition age at 14, but current law under IDEA says 16. So an example of something that if we were going to have that kind of surgical approach, would bring the transition age down to 14 for the whole country. And he said that Kentucky is ahead of the whole country on this issue, and we should be proud to be in Kentucky on that issue.
There are so few things that we can say that we should be proud of. Yes.
But I've never had a client that was beginning transition at age. I've never had a client that was beginning transition at age 14.
Yeah.
Because it's the expectation is not there from the teachers, and the families are usually, dealing day to day. So you don't get to, you just want to get through Monday.
Yeah.
I
have heard some parents. I heard this Lucy, Austin, somebody here, lawyers, was actually at one of our meetings Wednesday, and there was actually a parent talking about, they actually started talking about transition planning for my son was 14. So I mean, there's at least a couple of examples where it's, where it's going right. But I think if we could say, all right, this is what it says here, we just need to make sure the laws are consistent and keep it confined as opposed to getting into all the due process stuff, where you could really see some really big scale weakening.
Right. And they will talk about about transition at 14, but then usually the next sentence is, but it's not time to have that conversation yet.
Well, and services is still, goals or services are still 16.
Right. I think where we are, I think it's kind of those two different factions that are worrying about anything opening up education in Kentucky, period, because we're all the other extraneous issues that aren't really related to education, because the bathroom bills will come up. The charter school piece will be thrown back.
Are bathrooms an issue in the South right now?
You have to know where to go. And if you don't have a legislative body telling you, it's going to be real, that. So that was, that's problematic. And like in the charter school piece, and that's one of the things that continues to scare me, is that we know that the kids that we're talking about are going to be left out of that boat in charter schools, and I think that it has a long, long way to go to be viable here. It's something that the governor has expressed an interest in, but
there's actually quite a bit of work going on for the charter schools. This past legislative session, they just increased the number of. Kentucky has like pilot charter schools right now. They just increased the number of those, and then there's also it's going to happen next year. We're going to get charter schools. 42 other states have one, and the governor, like Jeff said, the governor does want that, but it's starting to talk about it. I mean, everybody's got to be talking about getting people with disabilities at the table when they're making those discussions.
And they're
right. They're going to get lost otherwise.
And they're not going to be included. You're not
right.
going to.
Or there's going to be a school for those kids.
Yeah.
Which is what they're.
Right. That's my. I'm sorry, I'm off site. That's been my concern about charter schools in Kentucky. We only have 1 or 2 segregated facilities for children with disability, segregated schools for children with disabilities in our state, and I'm really worried that how the charter school legislation gets written will open that up. And oh my goodness.
Well, and it's a real concern because I was talking to a legislator who said just that. He said, these autism parents are in my office every day telling me that they want a school for their children. I said, well, I'm not sure that that's what that's exactly what they're saying. I think they want a school that is open and inclusive to their children. But we don't want a charter school bill that has a school for kids with autism and the kids for, the school for kids with CP and so.
And I'm not so sure, Stephanie. I think there are factions that are saying that we're getting right back to that segregated.
There's definitely
there's groups, and I think there are members of parent groups that would like to see.
But I guess
our voice just has to go up.
So.
But one thing I want to just kind of put on the table in this charter school conversation, I think a charter school at its best can be a laboratory for innovation that can improve the public education system. And at its worst, it can be a way to circumvent teachers' unions and worker rights and lots of other protections that took a long time to get into place. I don't feel like it's in our interest as a disability movement to be anti-charter schools and just assume that charter schools will always be the worst case scenario. I also think it is in our interest to have some innovation happening in the area of education of children with disabilities, because we're not getting the outcome. And, Harold, you talk about the percentage of kids that are, leaving school without an ability to communicate using I can't remember reliable mode. Well, let's keep innovating, and this is where a university center of excellence can be helpful, where academia in general can be helpful. But let's keep innovating until we find ways to do this for every kid. And I'm not saying charter schools are the only way to innovate, but they're not, because they're not. But I don't think we should take charter schools off the table as a way to innovate. And I think you can put parameters around charter schools in terms of segregated models. The beautiful thing about a charter school is it can be designed however people want to design it. We have a charter school in our neighborhood in Baltimore that our next door neighbor runs, and my wife is the chair of the board of it. It's an inner city charter school that's serving a very challenged inner city population and trying to deliver academic excellence and having some good outcomes with the population. Interestingly, the public school system, in exchange for giving them a building, said you have to have an autism classroom in your school. And what they meant by an autism classroom is literally a classroom where everybody in the classroom is autistic and they have no interaction with the other kids in the school. And that was insisted on by the Baltimore City Public Schools. So, sometimes I feel like charter schools are fun to kick around, and I'm sure charter schools in Kentucky aren't the same as charter schools in Maryland or wherever. But I just don't think it's in our interest as a movement to be anti-charter schools, because it gets heard by some legislators as anti-innovation.
Well, it's also futile. So if we know they're coming, let's be involved with them. Let's be at the table. I think that's what the message is been is, okay, we'll get on with this, but let us help you do it well.
A really good example of a charter school similar to that is actually connected with the Michigan USED. I don't know if it's with the Michigan USED specifically or just Barbara Roy, who helped to found it. She's the USED director in Michigan.
Retired.
But essentially, it was an inner city population, kids with an unbelievably high dropout rate. Probably more kids that are in the justice system than graduating, and then totally turning around that group of inner city youth to they're getting a tremendously high percentage, overwhelming majority going on to college and things, and really experimenting with and that. And I don't think if it was the youth that involved with just her, but it's a really powerful example of trying to solve a horrible problem in our society.
Great. Other questions or comments? Yeah, in the back.
I can read that one. The question is from Katie Goldie. She's a participant in Adobe. I work in the school system as an SLP, and many of my students are on alternative assessment. Parents are always very concerned about the limitations of an alternative diploma. I know other states have different models, like a multiple diploma model. In your opinion, are there advantages to other models, and is Kentucky considering moving towards another model?
Oh, I guess that one's for me then. Yeah. I haven't heard of anything, and maybe if someone else has in the room, of them discussing alternative. Of course, Harold has. A few years ago, there was discussion of alternative diplomas. Yeah. And I'm not sure where it stands at this point in time. To me, it's something that's always made sense, is that there has to be something where somebody gets something other than a certificate of completion, because if you've attended this school until you're 21, you can't even be hired by them to clean up the halls because you don't have a high school diploma. There's just so much of that hasn't made sense, and I think when we got a lot of the issues last time I remember one of the it was geometry. Well, how is somebody going to get a geometry credit? And if they, I don't know where it came from. They just kept going back to it. How are they going to get a geometry credit? It was almost like, if you have gay marriage, somebody's going to marry a goat. It just went right to those. It was those extremes. I never understood it. But they, it kind of died. And Harold,
Was there a comment from one of the remote locations?
Jackie Kearns may want to say
Oh, sorry, Coach Stream Nita. I just want to let you make sure you remember that in Kentucky we have been working on college and career for students in the alternate assessment, and we've got 4 pilot projects in the state, and we're getting ready to roll it out, in which students will have to do work-based learning and receive a certificate to show that they are career ready. And one way to do that is through the community-based work transition program, which has been in existence for 32 years now. And we're making big changes next year to serve all students eligible for OVR services in our schools, starting their last 3 years of school.
Yeah, and I guess my answer to the question of what are other states doing and kind of what would be considered a model. I don't think calling something an alternative or a special certificate of completion or kind of an asterisk next to the person's high school diploma in and of itself is the problem. The problem is, what does that mean after high school? So if you have a high school diploma with an asterisk and it makes it harder for you to get a job and it makes it harder for you to pursue higher education, then it's a problem. But I feel like all of that needs to be thought about together. What are we doing to help folks go from school into employment, into higher education, and into the kind of employment that can lead to a career? And what we call the diploma, in my view, doesn't answer the question. It's what does that mean in that labor market? If nobody can get a job in that labor market without a high school diploma, with a regular high school diploma, then we should be doing everything we can to make sure young people with disabilities are leaving school with a regular high school diploma.
And I think that, this is Jackie Kearns, I think that the reauthorization of ESSA is gonna help because in the law, it requires the states not preclude high school diploma for students participating in alternate assessment. So in Kentucky, we were the first state to do an alternate assessment, and that was one of the requirements just because the connection to curriculum was just seemed to be so far away. But I think now we have the technical expertise to do that. And I agree that what does the diploma mean? The end, think with the end in mind. What's the ultimate outcome we want to have, and then back map from there. But there has to be something behind it besides what's on the student's IEP, which is just a subset of essential things that the student needs to be able to access the entire curriculum. But so I'm thinking that since ESSA has stated that, and that's, there will be some, especially in Kentucky, there will be some new discussion about what does it mean and how do we do it.
Yeah, and see, that's really important because in effect, when that part of ESSA goes into effect, we will be in violation because you cannot automatically exclude a child from a diploma in the alternate portfolio. So that's a really important thing. The other thing is a little cited opinion from the Office of Civil Rights. This is very important. This takes somebody to challenge it, to use that to challenge some of the status of jobs. And what it said was a high school diploma cannot be required for a job simply because you want to put that in there. It has to be that the nature of the essential job functions required it. So, for example, in this state, you can't work in early child care. You can't work in child care or early childhood without a high school diploma, even if you're going to be doing a cook assistant, for example. All right? That job clearly does not require a high school diploma. All it would take is one person to challenge that through the Office of Civil Rights, and it would be struck down. Families don't recognize that, and a lot of times we don't recognize that, but that is an opinion of the Office of Civil Rights. So there are tools that we've got that are going to change the landscape.
Well, I think it has to be from, we've got to push legislation from the point of the employer to force the employer, because the employers are able to at this point say, because I work for a huge company and I know this is true and I support disability, and they say must have high school or GED. And so it needs to be something written into legislation, especially for electric contractors, that says that there is an accommodation or whatever to go along with that. If that person has that skill set, then they need to be able to prove that skill set. Then they shouldn't have to have that, in my personal opinion.
Yeah, the Office of Civil Rights has already said that they don't have to. But you're right. If it's, there's no, you still require someone to challenge each company or each state agency or whomever has put that in there, that this job doesn't require you to have this paper if you've got the skill set.
Right, and we don't have enough education in the community to say, you need to challenge that.
Yeah.
Because they see that written down, well, I can't work here, they said I can't.
But I want to bring this issue that you're bringing up right now back to the issue of who is on the federal bench. Because it's not just about writing laws, it's about how laws get interpreted. I would argue that the Americans with Disabilities Act already would say that when you do an analysis when a disabled person applies for a job that doesn't have a high school diploma, in part because of their disability, but are able to do the essential functions of the job with or without a reasonable accommodation, that requiring a high school diploma for that applicant is a violation of the ADA. It's creating an artificial criteria that is resulting in disabled people being excluded from the job disproportionately. There are federal judges that would agree with me, but the Supreme Court, in terms of where they've been and how they've bent over backwards on the side of employers, And the federal bench in general, which is following the Supreme Court, is very reluctant to read the ADA in that robust way. They're much more likely to say, well, a high school diploma is a basic requirement, and we don't see it as our job to question employers that want to use this as a shorthand to separate out people that they don't think